Welcome, everyone, to the Those Who Came Before Us podcast. I'm your host, David Ibanda. I thought we'd take a break from Bunyoro for a bit, because there's been a lot on my mind. This has been quite the year. The COVID pandemic hit, and we're all forced to social distance, and still are in a lot of places. And then the death of George Floyd, which kicked off a massive movement against police brutality and racism. Most Black people who saw that video felt this visceral reaction to it. In fact, everyone did. But specifically for Black people, we all felt we could have been George Floyd. Like we were linked. The blatant disregard for human life demonstrated in that moment was, I didn't have to watch the whole video. I couldn't. But this time, with nothing but time, people marched out in droves, despite the isolation orders, to demonstrate and express their anger. It wasn't just for his death. It was for all of it. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and many more. The Black Lives Matter movement triggered a response around the world. Many people stood in solidarity with Black Americans. Racism must end. No justice, no peace. Arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. All these were slogans that were shouted, among many more. It became the biggest movement in U.S. history. The shockwaves of it rippled globally, and people began to look at their own police departments. Seeing as this is an African history podcast, I'm going to focus on Africa. In this episode, I want to talk about police brutality on the continent, the history of police in Africa, and possible solutions. Now, where to start? I had a lot of trouble putting all of my thoughts onto paper for this. The reason being is I don't like just focusing on the problems of the motherland. Others have done a pretty good job of that. I'm looking at the media for this. It's a very real fear for me to not end up perpetuating the negative stereotypes of Africa. It's a huge part of my mission statement for this little project of mine. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can't talk about the problems, but there tends to be an overemphasis on the negative. I do also think that these problems need to be discussed more actively by Africans themselves with the intention of finding very real solutions to them. I hope this offers insight into the subject of police on the continent. So, let's start with Uganda, since it's my home. On Saturday night, June 28th, third-year veterinary medicine student of Makerere University, Emmanuel Tegu, was beaten up by either the police or the local defense units known as the LDUs. Tegu later died from injuries on July 4th, 2020. This story is very confusing. There are a lot of perspectives. Listen to journalist Solomon Kawesa explain the many viewpoints.
We have contradicting stories and statements from different people. We have people who say, who first came out and said that it were the LDUs who assaulted this young man. And then later on, police comes up with a statement that it is a mob. So we have been having questions that where could the mob have come from at that time, 10 p.m. in the night? You know, it is weird. We only expect maybe people doing patrols at that time to be walking around the university. So that has been a question of contention. Where did this mob come from that the police claims? Yet, we have another statement saying that there was a dying declaration where the guy was narrating to the mother that he was beaten up by security agents.
Yeah. That sigh of exasperation was what many Ugandans, including myself, released when we were trying to make sense of this. To make matters worse, footage captured from the St. Augustine Church was not being shown to the public. Journalists themselves were told that they could only see it after the police had looked at it. Now, that would be reasonable, except Ugandans don't trust the police. There were genuine fears that they were trying to hide something. Even when the footage was released and shown to journalists and the public, it was shown at a tilted angle and at a distance so one couldn't quite make out who was who or what the hell was happening on the screen. A cop was on the side explaining that Tegu was chasing two policemen and pelting them with stones. Okay. But these weren't the ones who killed him. He apparently ran into 3 guards from the Centenary Bank who subsequently beat him with metal chairs. The police claimed that it was Tegu's cries for help that attracted the attention of 10 to 15 people who joined the guards in beating him up because they believed that he was stealing. Many have rightfully questioned the likelihood of such a mob forming at 10 p.m. at night, pointing out that it's usually swarming with security. It's things like this that cause Ugandans to distrust their own police. The caginess surrounding the release of the footage led some to believe that it might have been doctored. Even when suspects were arrested, it did nothing to quell the people's fears, because a lot of those arrested are said to be innocent. This tension between the public and the Ugandan police is exacerbated by the LDUs, who are set loose upon the country to enforce COVID-19 lockdown restrictions. They are a paramilitary militia group created in 1987 to apparently fight criminality across the country. They are said to be part of the police. It didn't take long for accusations of misconduct to come forward, and I'm talking in all forms: video recordings, verbal attestations, photos in high quality HD, all of it, because there are many, many stories. Unfortunately, many of the victims will never receive justice, and some fear that they're going to be used in the upcoming 2021 Ugandan elections. In Kenya, their police force has been ranked as the most corrupt organization in the country for the past 2 decades. They are also notorious for police brutality. One of the country's most high-profile cases is the one of 16-year-old Muhammad Dahir Kyed. Muhammad was gunned down in broad daylight by Corporal Ahmed Rashid. Actually, that's not even accurate. He was executed in front of a crowd, and it was all caught on camera. Rashid grabbed Muhammad, shot him in the stomach as he begged for his life, and as he lay there bleeding out, Rashid put his foot on his back and asked for a loaded gun, which was handed to him, and then he finished him off. His crime? Apparently he was a thief. Corporal Rashid Ahmed has many victims. He reminds me of Josh Brolin's character in Sicario, The End Justifies the Means. He believes that he's dealing out justice and that the people he kills are gang members. But this couldn't be further from the truth. While yes, his brutal tactics offer a strange sense of comfort for those who suffer at the hands of gangs, families of the victims say that their children were targeted by Rashid. And let me state the obvious here. Rashid's trigger-happy nature is troubling for a police officer. He still roams the streets free. And with the COVID-19 lockdown, the numbers of police brutality cases have gone up. It's gotten so bad that President Uhuru Kenyatta had to apologize twice. Now let's move on to Nigeria, home of the continent's biggest economy. According to Amnesty International, Nigerian citizens are subject to torture, rape, extortion, and killings at the hand of the police. But in particular, the arm of the police called the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which has the idiosyncratic abbreviation of SARS. Yes, like the disease. SARS as a name certainly has the fear factor element to match the brutality that is associated with the group. A Nigerian lady by the name of Susan M.M. talked about her encounter with Al Jazeera. She said her and her friends were dragged out of a taxi and threatened with charges because they apparently dressed like prostitutes. During the incident, the police officers shot bullets into the air every time they tried to speak. Their only male friend with them was hit in the face with a gun when he too tried to speak up. They were then taken to the police station and thrown in cells. After that, the officers demanded that they pay them 80,000 naira, which would amount to 215 US dollars, or they would kill them and no one would find out. They ended up paying them 40,000 naira, which is 108, half of the initial amount they wanted, and they were let go. The irony here is that the squad was set up to combat theft, and yet, alas, here they were, stealing from the very people they were supposed to protect. This story is not at all unique. There are many incidences of SARS officers kidnapping citizens, torturing them, and then demanding money. SARS are so hated by Nigerians that many of them are calling for the disbanding of the group. And what does the Nigerian government have to say about this? In their eyes are all lies. They believe in the effectiveness of SARS. And to this day, not a single officer has been prosecuted. Many other African nations have their own issues with police brutality. Among them, South Africa and Zimbabwe, as you can tell with what is happening there right now. I could go on, but I think you guys get the idea. So let's go back in time. Since this is an African history podcast, I do think that it is important to understand the history of policing on the continent. Many of you are familiar with police brutality in America and why Black Americans are disproportionately targeted. In Africa, police forces were born out of a need to protect the colonial state. It was the only way for them to maintain control and enforce quote-unquote civilization. You need to teach the Africans that taxation is part of a modern state, you send the police. You need to force them to get the raw materials to make rubber for your capitalist empire, you send the Force Publique, which was a police force set up to protect the interests of the then Congo Free State. And this happened in Bunyoro, the kingdom that the current series is on, when the British used the police to put down the famous Nyangere Rebellion in 1907. So the police were set up as an occupying force in African colonies. This began to change in the 1920s and 30s as Africans settled into the new status quo. Indirect rule was embraced and traditional rulers were made to handle the day-to-day. Fast forward to the 1950s, after Europe was torn apart by the Second World War, there was an emergence of African leaders who were able to challenge the colonialists in their own arena, asking questions like, "Riddle me this. You say that all men are created equal, but yet you withhold our freedom." You then see a resurgence of militia-type police being used to squash dissent like the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, beginning in 1952 to 1960, and also the extended war for independence in Algeria and many other countries. By the 1960s, a lot of African countries were independent. This was supposed to be the era of change, but the police forces maintained their identities as protectors of the state rather than of the people. Here's why that happened. The exit of European colonial nations left power vacuums. Many African countries had to find their own identities. After all, states looked very different in pre-colonial times. These new countries were inventions of Europeans that didn't take into account the many different groups inhabiting them. What transpired was a fight for power in many African states, and since the colonial way of doing things was all they knew and had worked for that particular country, they put that to work. So let's talk about Congo, specifically the Democratic Republic of Congo, because there's another one, Congo Republic, or otherwise known as Congo-Brazzaville. As I mentioned before, the first police in Congo were the Force Publique, which were King Leopold's own personal army. If you don't know, King Leopold was the mass-murdering lunatic that took Congo as his own personal property. His goal was to maximize profit at all costs. As a matter of fact, he used a commission model to incentivize the Force Publique to wring the Congolese of every last drop that they could possibly offer. He implemented rubber quotas, sanctioned the widespread use of torture through the chopping off of right hands, and outright murder for the sake of it. Cut off limbs were taken as proof of how many anti-government rebels they killed. The more they had, the more they were paid. These arms weren't just those of men, but also of women and children. It's even said that a major officer called Captain Leon Rom decorated the perimeter of his house with the heads of his victims. It's important that you hear this so you can understand how Leopold laid the foundation for how the police was supposed to work. After much international pressure, Leopold relinquished control and DRC was given to Belgium. Now, the Force Publique was both a police force and an army. It was headed by white Belgians, and under them were many local police departments. And as mentioned, most of their job was to protect the state by combating rebellion. However, by 1960, Congo got its independence and chose Patrice Lumumba, the well-remembered African independence leader, as their prime minister. But things didn't go well for them, because soon after independence, Congo fell into a political crisis. There was a mutiny in the Force Publique, 2 states were threatening secession and were being supported by the Belgians. The UN sent help but weren't interested in using force against the secession states, which prompted Lumumba to seek help with the Soviets and subsequently sealed his own fate. Within less than a year, Lumumba had been executed due to the combined actions of the US, Belgium, and his Congolese opponents. Congo and Lumumba were unfortunate victims caught up in a larger-scale battle for dominance between the world's biggest superpowers. I'm talking about the Cold War here. During all this time, the Force Publique couldn't function the way that it was supposed to. The UN took over security in the country, and by 1966, a new man was in power. And his name was Mobutu Sese Seko. With the backing of the US and their allies, Mobutu was able to seize power. One of the changes that he implemented was the creation of the PNC, the Police National Congolaise, which was an amalgamation of the many police departments and was given the task of ensuring public safety. Sadly, they just turned out to be his personal army. Congo had managed to gain independence, but had inherited the colonial system. The police went through multiple changes over the coming decades, in 1972, in 1984, and then again in 2002. All this time, the Congolese people suffered at the hands of the police and the army. From colonial through to the reign of Mobutu, and then the subsequent wars from 1996 to 2002. 2002 was when it was included in the Constitution that the police existed for the public. It was not to be affiliated with any political party, but simply to exist as a force of good. In 2006, multiple international organizations set out to reform the police in the country. What they found was a deep mistrust and fear for those wearing uniforms, whether it was the army, police, or even a happy medium like the gendarmerie. They had been scarred and were experiencing a form of generational PTSD. Laura Thurman wrote about her research on police reform in DR Congo. She conducted fieldwork with a special unit in Kinshasa that fought organized crime and gang violence, and she found that the officers there took great pride in their uniforms. They wore specialized uniforms that made it easier for the public to trust them. People respected them as opposed to the regular police and army. That being said, Thurman noted the highly militarized nature of this new special unit. They used military titles for their superiors, the militaristic behavior of the officers, even the recruitment video included saluting and marching, and they saw their work as a fight for the country. They described the gangs as enemies of the state, even though the gangs, called kulunas, are mostly made up of children who are armed with machetes, bottles, and stones. This us versus them mentality isn't at all unique to the Congolese police, but you can see how it goes against the idea of the police existing for the public, because like it or not, these people are members of society, and they were brought to those situations by circumstances beyond their control. It seems like even with all the changes, the army vibe was ingrained in the DNA of policing in the country. Is that necessarily a bad thing? That depends. In Congo's case, that may not be what they need. But there is also evidence that militarized police like the gendarmerie and the carabinieri, I'm probably saying that wrong, work in other countries. Now, Congo is only one nation in Africa, and it does not at all represent what others are like. They might be similar, yes, but they're not the same. I do want to stress that I cannot talk about every single African country. I'll be here for years. So I'll use specific examples and try to give an overview to create an understanding of policing in Africa. So with that said, let's turn our attention to South Africa. Most of you are on some level familiar with the history of South Africa. There was apartheid and then independence in 1994. During apartheid, the focus of the police was to contain the black population and enforce apartheid. The national police would use all sorts of methods to quell civil unrest: tear gas, live rounds, swarms of officers invading townships. Independence was supposed to change that, and they were on the right track. The idea was to have the police service focus on the prevention of crime instead of fighting it like some war. Even the name was changed from police force to police service. And for the first time ever, Black South Africans were able to call on the police for their problems, although not everyone was comfortable with this. Unfortunately, the apartheid methods of policing were a lot harder to stop than they realized. Jonny Steinberg explains that the democratic era saw the police transition from serving apartheid to serving the ANC political party. And it all started with the election of Nelson Mandela's successor, President Thabo Mbeki, in 1999. And in the year 2000, Mbeki appointed South Africa's first black police chief, called Jackie Selebi. Now, this man had no police experience, but had been an ANC member for a very long time, and soon, Selebi began to use the police against his own party. But why? During this time, South Africa wasn't doing well economically. President Thabo Mbeki swore to change things through things like limited privatization, tight fiscal management, and wage restraint. But that was opposed by various members in the ANC party. Steinberg tells us that the ANC has a diverse group of opinions and political views, which makes it even more difficult to manage. So to make sure that he was able to do what he set out to do, Mbeki directed Selebi to spy on opponents in his own party. This meant directing police resources to doing this. Selebi would personally call investigators and demand they look into so-and-so, a major member of the ANC. However, Selebi discovered that the detective branch was difficult to control. Or at least, that was believed to be the real reason for what he did next, because he dissolved them and scattered them across police stations in the country, arguing that the most specialized units should be doing more groundwork. The consequences of this were felt almost immediately by police. A police officer who would need to collaborate with someone, let's say in forensics, would find out that that forensic expert that he needs has been sent to a faraway part of the country, making it difficult to reach them. 2007 rolled around, and Selebi was fired amid a host of corruption allegations in the ANC. It turned out that one of the many spies Selebi was working with was a mafia boss responsible for the murder of criminal businessman Brett Kebble. Such actions are among the many reasons South Africans are losing faith in the ANC. Selebi's replacement, Bheki Cele, was more direct in his embrace of heavy-handed police methods. He set up groups of military-trained police called the Tactical Response Teams, otherwise known as the TRTs. The goal was to fight violent criminals such as armed bank robbers or cash-in-transit robbers, like in Fast and Furious, or whatever heist movie you like. They were a SWAT-like team, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, but where it went wrong was when they were put under the police division in charge of public order, which resulted in them being deployed to deal with protesters. Let me read you the stats to show you how quickly things escalated. Between 2004 and 2009, only 4 people had died in protests. In 2010 alone, after the deployment of the TRT, 3 had died, and then 11 between February and July of 2011. People began complaining about them, and then they were then removed from the scene, only to be brought back in 2012 to murder 34 miners at the Maracana mine protests. So you have to ask yourself, how did something like this happen? How did 34 people end up being murdered by the police? This wasn't just a strike that got out of hand as the crowd got even more rowdy. There were two crime scenes. The first one was a scene of quite literally a firing squad where 17 people were killed. 500 meters away, 20 minutes later, 17 more miners were shot to death as they tried to flee and hide. The official police narrative was that drug-crazed miners attacked the police and they had no choice but to open fire. I mean, how else do you explain people asking for better pay and work conditions? Only druggies would conceive of such a concept. The reality was that the owner of the mine, the Lon Min conglomerate, was involved. They wanted the matter to end, but it was also a political issue. You see, there was concern that the miners were giving their support to the Economic Freedom Fighters Party, which is described as a radical leftist group. This, they feared, would impact the 2014 elections. So on the orders of current President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was then sitting on the board of the Lon Min conglomerate, ordered that the crowd must be dispersed at all costs. Ramaphosa allegedly collaborated with his fellow Lon Min board members to increase police response to the situation and to find a way to make the strike criminal. I use the word allegedly because an investigation into the whole matter found him to be innocent. He apparently did not order the deaths, nor did he know that any of that was going to happen. Many South Africans remain unconvinced. What's interesting is that multiple police officers, while shocked at the massacre, also defended their colleagues. They claimed that they must have had a good reason to do so. Again, this isn't unique to South Africa. Police officers around the world do tend to side with each other. It's us versus them. Andrew Faull mentions that there is another reason why South Africa's policemen defended their colleagues. He explains that they hated being disrespected. And what does it mean to be respected as a police officer? It means compliance. They rationalize it as the crowd must have refused their orders. And you see the same thing happen with American cops when they're questioned or filmed or resisted. They lose control, their composure just goes out the window, and violence becomes their go-to. It becomes about trying to establish dominance. Respect is something that police officers, including South African police officers, need. Consider the case of Maido Macia. Macia was a 27-year-old Mozambican taxi driver living in South Africa. And on the 26th of February 2013, police tried to arrest him for allegedly parking illegally. Macia resisted, but officers managed to handcuff him to the inside of the back of the police van. And without putting him inside, they drove off, dragging Macia for hundreds of meters like those I just got married cans. Unfortunately, 2 hours later, he was dead. The autopsy report showed that he had died from a lack of oxygen to the brain and had a lot of internal bleeding. This was a result of a beating that Macia had suffered at the hands of police officers when they got to the station. As you can imagine, the public was outraged and protests began, demanding the arrest of those involved. 9 officers were taken into custody, and Faull tells us that at the bail hearing, one of the officers involved, in a last-ditch effort to save themselves by garnering sympathy, claimed that Macia had called him a useless policeman. Adding insult to injury, he had resisted arrest in front of everybody. In their eyes, this is more than enough to earn him a beating to the point of death. And as is usually the case, they tried to discredit the victim. They claimed that Macia wasn't at all an angel and that he had been involved in an accident that killed 5 children. And that's how he got his injuries. Which is quite absurd. They verbatim said that he died due to natural causes that he got from an accident before, which is a lot like the George Floyd case. Maido Macia had extensive injuries. He had defensive bruises on his arms, his organs were damaged, his heart, lungs, spleen, not to mention the severe swelling on his testes that showed that he had been tortured. They didn't just beat him, they tortured him. And this was further backed up by blood spatter analysis that revealed blood everywhere in the cell. If anyone had those kinds of injuries, there is no way they would have been able to go back to work like the police were claiming that Macy had done. Thankfully, the courts agreed and 8 of the 9 officers were given 15 years in prison each. Take notes, USA. No police officer should be above justice. The horrific beating of Maido Macia was just one of many. Faull tells us that beatings were routinely used by South African police officers as a way to acquire respect. People were routinely beaten in cells since this was out of public view. But Faull also explains that this was a performance. Officers didn't just want respect of the public, but also that of their peers. And they believed that one of the best ways to get their peers' esteem was to exhibit violence. It was like they were subconsciously signaling to each other, "Smack! Look at how much he fears me now. Smack, smack! Aren't I mighty? Smack!" He also recounted a conversation with an officer that explained that they weren't as respected as the TRTs because he believed it was because they weren't allowed to use violence. The TRT were allowed more leeway. They could beat, torture, and this, he said, led to the decrease in crime. The TRT are the same group I mentioned before who were responsible for dealing with armed criminals. Despite not having any data to back up this decrease in crime, what is interesting is that this officer believed that violence was directly correlated to respect. Now that I've given you an overview of police on the continent, let's talk about solutions. What can we do to change things? What is already being done? To begin with, there isn't a lot of information on policing in Africa. It is unfortunately not a very popular subject in academia. The focus tends to be on the decline of the continent, or the economics of the continent. In the book, Police in Africa, Jan Beek and others write about the need for more ethnographic work on the police. This will allow us to understand police in Africa and how they relate socially to others. We need more info on what we're dealing with, on how police see themselves, the extent to which they do or don't do their jobs, and why. For instance, research has revealed that while most African citizens think poorly of their police, some countries, like Malawi, Mozambique, and Namibia, tend to view them more favorably. And why is that? In Mozambique, for example, Helen Maria Kyed tells us that while the Maputo police is known for corruption, extortion, and even extrajudicial killings, there is another side of them that goes unnoticed by foreign reformers. This side is informal and therefore invisible to those trying to understand policing in Maputo City, Mozambique. It turns out that Maputo police officers acted like mediators inside police stations. When people would come to them with a problem, let's say theft, officers would give each person a chance to explain their side, and they would then work to hash out a deal that is suitable for the case, whether that is repaying the stolen money or repaying the stolen item. They would then sign documents to seal the agreement. The case then never gets recorded. If this didn't work, the police would open up an actual case. The takeaway from this is that people preferred this method of doing things. They wanted the police to provide justice up front and in a flexible way. As Kyed calls it, the softer justice principles of compensation and reconciliation, mediated by notions of familiarity or by efforts to bring out familiarity and closeness, is what they were looking for. For Mozambicans, a good police officer was one who didn't follow the rules. The rules were seen as too rigid and the law unreliable, too long and expensive. It is why when the UNDP was trying to reform the police, they still found that people branded them as ineffective. And this led them to conclude that the Mozambican police couldn't be reformed. So this is an example of how research can open our eyes into the expectations of police officers and how to create reform that works for the public. but more importantly, reforms that work for Africans. As Professor Alice Hills questions in the book Police in Africa, should liberal ideas of police be transferred to Africa? Most reforms are based on Anglo-American police research, but how does that translate to Africa? We need to figure out if they could be adopted on the continent and how we can modify reforms to work in African contexts. That way we can form more professional police services. Speaking of professionalism, Joel Glasman writes how that word professionalism is not properly defined. We often say that we expect our police to be professional, the idea being that it's something to aspire to. But what exactly does that mean? During his research on Togolese police, Glasman found that it meant something different to various police officers. Professional meant having a proper uniform to one, to another it meant handling paperwork very well. The answers to what it meant to be professional were wide-ranging. So the word needs to be properly defined and understood so officers know exactly what is expected of them. Now, you can't talk about the failure of the police without talking about the failure of the state. Unfortunately, a number of African nations have weak institutions. This trickles down from the top into every facet of society, including the police. So they end up being poorly trained, lacking access to equipment, and lacking accountability and having a wrong mindset. So we have to acknowledge how much of a factor this plays into police actions. How do we expect our police departments to not be corrupt when those at the top are even worse? Police are operating in a corrupt system, and one would argue are simply trying to do what they can to survive. This doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do about it. Change is going to be a long time coming. In the meantime, we can consider alternative actions in an effort to mitigate the situation. One of these alternatives is plural policing. It basically means the incorporation of others into the provision of police services. So instead of policing services being provided solely by the public police, others like private security firms and community vigilantes can fill that role. Yes, I did say vigilantes, but not vigilantes like we've come to understand them through comics and Marvel movies. It's basically like a neighborhood watch. And they wouldn't just take the law into their own hands, but rather would act, as Jamamlar calls it, an extension of the police. An example of this is in Plateau State, Nigeria. During colonial times, law and order was maintained by the Native Authority Police Force. They were answerable to local governments that were headed by chiefs who in turn answered to the colonial administration. This was an example of Britain's indirect rule in African colonies. This continued even after independence until 1976 when the force was disbanded and absorbed into the Nigerian Police Force, or NPF. Part of the changes stripped traditional leaders of their statutory power, although they were still seen and recognized by the public as an authority within their own right. So, with the establishment of local governments that were not associated with traditional leaders, they had to find ways to compete for power and to maintain it. And one of the ways of doing that was by forming neighborhood watch groups, or as they came to be known as, the Yanbanga. The way they enforced their rules, however, differed depending on which communities they were from. Christian communities would have their own brand of justice. Same with traditional followers. For instance, traditional followers would punish theft by public flogging, then subject them to the dance of shame, where the suspect would dance in front of a crowd while being insulted. The point is, from then on, vigilante groups became a mainstay in Nigerian society. One called the Vigilante Group of Nigeria is actually registered with the state. Jamamlar argues that the existence of these groups can be seen as the extension of the police. They can be used to help out wherever the police can't. Of course, operating under the police code and with reduced powers. This way, we can offload some of the burdens onto the community who actually might be able to do a better job since they belong to those communities. We see an example of this with the Borno Vigilantes, otherwise known as the Civilian Joint Task Force. They have been noted as being very successful against Boko Haram, the terrorist organization, by identifying members. There are cons to this, however. The biggest one being, there is a big risk that they could get out of control. An example of this is the Mungiki group in Kenya. They started out as protectors of Kikuyu farm interests against the Maasai tribe and the Kalenjin-dominated government. Sadly, in time, they became a criminal organization. Some even likened them to the American Mafia or Japanese Yakuza. Same thing with the Borno vigilantes. They have been criticized for extrajudicial killings. The International Crisis Group recommends that the objectives and mandates must be made as clear as possible. Furthermore, there must be oversight from a number of organizations like the government, the police, and local communities. They cannot be allowed to step into local governance roles, otherwise this can prolong their existence and allow them to solidify their power. Lastly, we can consider using technology to be able to hold police accountable, increase effectiveness, and help with community policing. One of the ways we already do this is through recording interactions with the police. Now, I know police don't like this, but it has proven to be an effective way of holding them accountable through shame. But we can take this a step further by utilizing programs like Ushahidi. For those who don't know, Ushahidi is an open source software founded by Kenyans that crowdsources information on whatever it is that you want to know about. For instance, it was used to map the political violence during Kenya's 2007 elections. It was used in Russia to track wildfires, and by Nigeria to ensure that the 2011 elections were fair. Citizens were able to report incidences of electoral fraud by simply sending a text or calling dedicated numbers in either Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, or Pidgin. And for the first time ever, Nigerians were able to monitor their elections, thereby holding their governments accountable. We can do the same thing with the police. Countries can consider using Ushahidi to report and map incidences of police corruption, brutality, and extortion. This could also be used to make reports about crime and help with the collection of vital crime information. In fact, there actually was an Ushahidi-based program called Hatari that did this. Anyone could report crimes and corruption by sending a text, tweet, or email, and it was all anonymous. Unfortunately, it didn't take off. Professor Stephen Livingstone, who has written a lot on the subject of digitally enabled governance, explains that Hatari failed because they didn't get the word out properly. It's not enough to just have the program, you have to let people know. You have to inform them constantly and to bring everyone on board. This could be local companies, businesses, local governments, leaders, schools, everyone. Because in order for this to work, everyone has to be on the lookout. All in all, change has to come from the top. These alternatives work, but only to a certain extent. Our governments need to deal with their shortcomings in order to make a long-lasting change. And that's all for today, everyone. My name is David Ibanda, and thank you for listening to the Those Who Came Before Us podcast.